It's integration. It's become a real buzzword in psychedelic circles, but I think we rarely talk about it in depth. I think it's only the last MAPS conference and this conference now that is bringing together a panel to really explore the topic within a therapeutic setting. I think that the idea that psychedelic experiences could or even should be integrated, or the idea that psychedelic experiences are an expression of the unconscious, would be highly debatable in mainstream therapeutic circles, which is quite bizarre. But then the very same circles were really not sure about dream analysis not so long ago. I think that the mainstream view is still that psychedelic experiences produce nothing more than a series of meaningless hallucinations. And this is a position that we need to challenge because I think it's hopelessly out of touch and out of date at this point. Psychedelic experiences give voice and expression to the unconscious. They mediate between the structures of our conscious and an unconscious self. And our attempts to analyze and interpret this can support healing, growth, and development. Psychotherapy has advocated the importance of integrating psychedelic unconscious material into consciousness since its very beginning. I mean, that's the foundation it developed on. And it has created clinical frameworks for integrating material that arise out of dreams, free association, active imagination, creative artwork. And these clinical frameworks are very relevant and very useful for us when we consider the integration of psychedelic experiences. Entheogenic experiences, like dreams, if they're properly understood and integrated, they carry forward a process of development and healing. Our failure to do so can negatively impact our psychological development. A therapeutic setting with a skilled therapist can significantly improve integration outcomes. I think that just as important is the client being willing to put in the time and work required for integrating these experiences, because it takes time to really integrate these experiences. A therapeutic framework can provide support because I think that insight by itself is not a sufficient force of change. I think that self-knowledge often needs to be met by external frameworks that can help us move from an intellectual knowing of something to a more visceral kind of knowing, a deeper sense of knowing. And unless the material that arise out of psychedelic experiences are sufficiently integrated, they can easily just sink back into the unconscious. Some of the experiences we have with psychedelics are encounters with archetypal worlds. They are very strange and bizarre dreamlike sequences that can overwhelm consciousness, and they can be very difficult to decipher in a meaningful way. The therapeutic space is very fluid in translating the symbolic language of the unconscious into a meaningful narrative and create links between conscious and unconscious, create bridges between the two. Therapy has had a long-standing focus and intention on strengthening our consciousness by assimilating the unconscious. When these experiences are understood within the context of a person's life, when they're developed and expressed creatively and they're worked through within a therapeutic framework, they can be transformational. The gift they leave us with is further ego solidity, further ego strength, by having incorporated just a little bit more of our undercurrent underworlds. Some people believe that these experiences will solve all their problems, and some people believe that psychedelic experiences will bring them all the healing they need. They are reluctant to allow integration time between experiences, and sometimes they jump from one experience to the next, hoping that the next one will solve the previous one, and they can end up in a bit of a muddle sometimes. Certainly when they reach us, they can be in a bit of a muddle. They don't put in the personal effort required for supporting their experiences. To simply catapult ourselves into transcendent space in and of itself is of very little value if we remain passive and unconscious. To adopt a passive stance towards our unconscious, to not take personal responsibility for our process, and to allow these experiences to dictate our actions and our ways forward can carry enormous risks. To genuinely transcend, we need to maintain the responsibility of bringing back the gifts of the imaginal world into a relationship with our everyday lives. A therapeutic space can be a very useful container for sorting out what belongs to the past and what belongs to the present, what belongs to the mythic and the mystic dimensions, and what belongs to the earthly dimensions of everyday living, what belongs to the personal and what belongs to the collective, and it can help us accommodate these where they belong. It can offer a balancing space between states, dimensions, and worlds. Carl Jung himself was opposed to the use of psychedelic substances, and there's a really wonderful book by Scott Hill that Tim has published in Maswell Hill Press. It's called Encounters with the Unconscious, that exemplifies Jung's relationship with psychedelics and really understands it in great depth. Jung's very unique insights into the archetypal layers of experience came from his own personal psychic openings in the 4 years following his split with Freud, which were extremely distressing and disorienting. His terrifying encounters with his unconscious, once they were integrated, they became the foundation of his future theories. And they're very relevant when we consider today the integration of psychedelic experiences. Carl Jung distinguished between the collective unconscious and the personal unconscious. He saw the personal unconscious as a rather superficial layer, made up of contents that have at some point been part of consciousness but have disappeared from consciousness by either being forgotten or repressed. He saw the collective unconscious, on the other hand, as a much deeper layer, made up of contents that have never been part of our individual consciousness. He said they have never been individually acquired. He has a really cosmic quote about that. He says about the collective unconscious, this is a common psychic substrate of a suprapersonal nature, universal and impersonal, present in all of us and filled with primordial universal images that have existed through the remotest of times. That mythic layer of our collective psyche is filled with archetypes. Archetypes, as he says, are primordial images. They are living psychic structures. They bring into consciousness thoughts, intuitions, affects that were buried deeply within, and they express themselves primarily in symbols and in metaphors. Their ultimate form was never fully conscious and never can be, because they reside in great depths. We can never fully explain and get rid of an archetype, dispose of it. We can only get through to its essence by approximation. We can only get near enough. For the formation of the self, for the unity of the self, primordial powers of great depth need to come awake and intervene. Conscious will by itself is not a sufficient force that can actually unite the personality. These messengers mediate between conscious and unconscious self, and their aim is to restore wholeness and unity of the self. For Jung, that's the way to individuation, which he considered to be the ultimate developmental task in someone's life. He describes individuation as a process of self-realization through psychological integration. This is a movement towards meaning, purpose, and wholeness. The unconscious offers compensating symbols into consciousness, and consciousness has to receive this and integrate this. And that's always the movement. The unconscious offers, the conscious receives. The underlying primary psychic reality is so inconceivably complex that it can be grasped only at the farthest reach of intuition, and then, but very dimly. This is why it needs symbols. Symbols hold content that is indefinite. They can never be fully interpreted. They're in contrast to signs. Signs hold content that is very fixed, very narrow, and very particular. But even though they can never be fully interpreted, they still carry the potential of union between conscious and unconscious self. They're still carriers of the potential of unity and self-wholeness and self-unity. These images, however irrational they may appear, images, symbols, visions that come through in a psychedelic experience, however irrational they may appear, They are the best possible expression of an unconscious fact that is not yet fully understood by consciousness. And they're carriers of vital psychological information, and we need to treat them as prognostic, diagnostic, and therapeutic facts. In integration, we follow the psyche in a world of irrational experience in search of meaning. Psychedelic experiences need to be understood through a process of synthetic interpretation, synthetic assimilation. Beyond the aesthetics of the psychedelic experience lies a world of meaning, and we absorb this meaning through the faculties of cognition, that's mind, conscious and unconscious, body, psyche, soul. In addition to that, what we absorb can carry personal as well as collective resonance. The picture that then emerges is a fairly complex one with multiple layers and levels of integration potential. It is in our wholeness that we meet with these experiences. It is in their wholeness that they need to be considered for integration, and it is our sense of wholeness that they carry forward and support. That wholeness is the union between conscious and unconscious. It rests on that synergy, on that connection. The new attitude towards life, or the new attitude towards oneself, or the new consciousness that arises out of the tension between conscious and unconscious and supports their union is what Jung called the transcendent function. And this is the ultimate post-integrated position. In integration, we work with the language of the psyche, with the archetypal and the mythopoetic layers of our experience and our existence. We have to frame the irrational in a way that helps us harness the psychological realities that the symbols and these images carry forward and express. We have to try and make some sense of it. These experiences, again, however irrational they may appear, they're a symbolic manifestation of our unconscious state. Integration is a process of extraction where we reduce the unconscious material into its most general principles. We work through the idea contained within an experience in order to solidify the messages of the unconscious into consciousness. When we work with such material, our first task is to establish the context of the vision, image or symbol, alongside the context of the person's life that these experiences have come out from with minute care. We bring the images into a concrete dimension and we work with them creatively in order to develop them to their full effect and their full dimension. None of these experiences can be understood in and of themselves in isolation. We need to understand them up against the stable backdrop of a person's life experiences and background if we are to really make sense of them. Psychedelic experiences take their character from daily life, and if they seem irrational, it is only because we lack the means to understand them. When we have a difficult psychedelic experience, the question we need to ask is not why we had that experience, but what is its purpose? And we can refine that question by asking, what conscious attitude does it compensate? Because the conscious and the unconscious have a compensatory relationship. And often the material that will emerge out of the unconscious are there to restore a one-sidedness in our consciousness. Consciousness is selective. Aldous Huxley, the reducing valve, is the best metaphor we can get for that. Selectivity means and requires exclusion. And what is excluded exists in our unconscious. And from there, it forms a counterweight and it creates a tension that every now and then needs to be alleviated by incorporating a little bit of our unconscious into our consciousness. The more we exclude our unconscious, the more unpredictable and dangerous it becomes. Once we start assimilating the unconscious, then its danger and threat diminishes. Difficult psychedelic experiences can be terrifying, they can be frightening, and they can be traumatic, because they can overwhelm consciousness and they can be very hard to really make sense of. Through psychedelic use, sometimes repressed and forgotten memories can resurface into consciousness. And this can be an extremely painful and confusing experience. Firstly, because the first conflict that arises is this true? That this really happened? And the other is because it can bring really painful emotions back in the surface. However, sometimes the resurfaced material sort of gets us to get back in touch with something that we sort of felt we knew all along. Sometimes these experiences can explain a long-term depression. They can explain a particular phobia we have with certain conditions. They can explain a difficulty in our sexuality. So they carry information that can really unlock something that was locked for a very long time. The disturbing in the dark easily gets repressed because consciousness tries to somehow find a way to deal with it, perhaps by not dealing with it. And the darkness that can return during resurfaced memories sometimes belongs to others and had been inflicted on us, and sometimes belongs to us. And it constitutes what Jungians call the shadow. This is a very painful gift from one's depths. It's very painful because it's confusing and disorienting, but it is a gift because it finally facilitates the expression of repressed emotion. Through shadow work, we come to experience a truer but perhaps darker sense of self. It is a process that carries the possibility of wholeness because we experience a fuller sense of self. And it reminds us that in psychological work, wholeness is not synonymous with perfection. Wholeness is synonymous with integration. And the end result might be a lot less perfect, but it will be more true and it will be more whole. Through shadow integration, we come to experience a fuller sense of self. And here the work is not to process and eliminate the shadow. Here the work is to become aware of the shadow and relate to it from a more conscious position. The spirit and the body will always cast a shadow. We need to be aware of it and know where it is. The journey into another reality is always perilous. Such experiences are certainly not without their dangers because they're also the very matrix of psychosis. Numinous experiences can have a dark side that is as powerful as its light side, and archetypes can profoundly disturb and even possess consciousness. In these journeys, we're treading the liminal borderlands between conscious and unconscious that can be as full of creative potential as of disastrous ruin. Here is the stuff of madness, creative inspiration, spiritual realization. Dose, setting, preparation, intention, integration, and ego strengths is what will determine our ability to withstand and navigate the uprise of unconscious content. In integration work, we need a resilient conscious sender in the client that can do the assimilating. Because working with a collapsed and disoriented consciousness is one of the most difficult transitions a therapist ever has to work with, because we then have to contain an experience that lacks any sense of direction or any sense of grounding. We can equate this extreme state of ego dissolution to a state of soul loss. If the ego is too overwhelmed and too weakened from the experience, then our first task is in separating the ego from its identification with unconscious material in order to restore and reset its ability to integrate and assimilate. We cannot really work without it working to a certain standard that it can do the assimilating. Once integration happens, then a structural shift in consciousness comes as a result. When consciousness has to accommodate something, then everything has to change to accommodate that something. It doesn't sort of miraculously just fit in there. For psychological transformation to really occur, the ego needs to be shifted by a conscious relationship to the newly assimilated unconscious. To enter treatment as a therapist is to enter a journey into with another person. And while equipped, we must always treat each new experience as something new. And we must allow ourselves to be open enough to enter the journey, willing to learn as much as the person we're working with. We need to take each experience within the context of the person and the context of the person's life. And we need to be prepared to enter a journey into the unknown. Our conscious attitude towards the unconscious will be a significant factor in this process. If we view the unconscious as a devouring darkness that carries destructiveness and madness in fragmentation without anything else, then its potential to be so will be amplified. If we relate to the unconscious through its potential to release darkness in service of light, then we can recenter it and realign it to its true force and purpose. The moment consciousness starts assimilating the unconscious, its danger and threat diminishes. The patience, courage and faith that sometimes this work requires, both from therapists and from clients, can be supported by a knowing and a trusting in the teleology of the psychedelic experience. Psychedelic experiences, the unconscious, our psyche, they are purposeful. The psyche self-regulates through the movement of unconscious contents. A difficult psychedelic experience carries enormous wisdom in its process. Breakdown is the initial stage of a creative journey towards wholeness. This is a process that is there to report and restore a one-sidedness in our consciousness. If we fail to understand its language and if we fail to support its creative process, the breakdown might need to repeat itself again and again and again until the deeper balance is finally restored. Despite the potential of some psychedelic experiences to be disorienting, traumatic, and initiate psychotic and archetypal openings, if these processes are truly supported and integrated, they can provide very significant developmental turning points for our personal and psychospiritual growth. A temporary disorder is in service of a latent order that's of greater complexity, clarity, and wisdom. Tribal cultures that have respected the healing power of altered states have developed age-old practices and frameworks for the use of plant medicines, and Krista will tell us a lot more about this. She won't. These cultures attend to the rites and rituals with enormous precision and care, because these are containers that are there to safeguard the experience and avert harm and avert psychic injuries. These frameworks are a channel of teachings and experience and energy for the participants that they receive through communion with sacred plants. Through our contact with these cultures, we are starting to understand what an appropriate setting might actually look like. And we're also starting to get an idea of what respectful and skillful use of these substances might look like. These cultures have their own conceptual systems and their own cosmologies through which they understand encounters with the spirit world. In the West, this has been the domain of psychotherapy. And I think that at this moment, we need to build resilient systems and movements within the psychotherapeutic world to upgrade the understanding it currently has about the potential and great potency of this healing stage, of altered states of consciousness, and how much they can inform the work we're actually already doing. I think at this point we also need to start considering the development of training schemes that can inform, support, and legitimize work with these substances. There are certain legal frameworks at this point where this work can take place. Hopefully, as David said, there will be a lot more in the future. The work that entheogenic journeys facilitate is not miraculous, but it does not fall far short. It's very near there. But it takes work, effort, and commitment for us to support the openings that these incredible agents and our incredible unconscious support and facilitate. These are openings that reach completion when supported by integration. Thank you very much.